But I think it's not unreasonable to consider Ukraine the first war of the energy transition. And so it's really imperative not only that Ukraine win the war, but that we take the lessons that we can about what the modern world and the way we manage and think about electricity, what are the new vulnerabilities that creates for states. And I expect that that's some of the big lessons going forward that we will carry from the Ukraine war. The damage to Ukraine overall has been extraordinary, but the damage to the energy infrastructure itself is both extraordinary, and we only have preliminary measurements of it. When the assessment was done midway through last year, the World Bank was estimating that there was $11 billion in damage to energy infrastructure itself and an additional $2 billion to municipal services. If we look at the present moment, there is a group that's trying to track the damage in real time, and they do a regular update of how many territories or areas under Ukrainian governance are without power. And by their report, as of January 22nd, there were 373 communities in Ukraine that were without electricity. And when we contemplate what that means for January in Ukraine, that's a lot of suffering and that's a lot of challenge. So this is really an extraordinary and unprecedented thing. Russia announced a month into, well, actually a week into the war, they announced to the IAEA that they had an intention of taking over the power plant. And they didn't succeed in fully taking over the power plant until many months later. But what they succeeded in doing in August of 2022 is raising the risk of Zaporizhzhia so high that both the United States and the International Atomic Energy Agency advised Ukraine that they really needed to shut the power plant down. After it was shut down, then Russia succeeded in taking full operational control, which they've had since October of 2022. And when we look at this, you might think it's got to be against international law to militarily take over a nuclear power plant. And the truth is, it isn't clearly against international law. It's shocking, it's reprehensible, but if you look at Article 56 of the Additional Protocols to the Geneva Convention, which was adopted in 1977, that article tries to say that there should be some protection for large hydropower and for nuclear facilities. But the thing is, there is a clause that says, unless such facility is essential to the adversary's prosecution of the war. In the modern world where we're so dependent on electricity, you could make the legal case that both the destruction of the major hydropower in Ukraine and the military occupation of the nuclear power plant were critical to the war effort because Ukraine was exporting electricity to Europe, and that was a source of revenue for the Ukrainian state. So with Russian troops massing on the border, Ukraine went ahead and took down its connections to all other grids, and it stood alone successfully during that first week of war. And they petitioned NSOE and said, we've met all the requirements, you have to let us in, we're at war. But Europe had an extraordinary decision to make. Do you include a new generation country into your grid when that country is at war? And there was a lot of debate about it, but in March of 2022, the European Union decided to allow Ukraine into the European grid. And so from March of 2022 until August of 2022, Ukraine was a significant exporter of electricity to Europe. So even though Ukraine itself was under attack, they were exporting electricity to Europe, helping blunt the impact of extraordinary electricity prices, helping blunt the impact of the loss of natural gas to Europe, and creating a source of revenue for Kyiv. Both the crisis of 1973, which was the Arab oil embargo, and the crisis of 1979, which was when Iran changed governance and fell out of the world market, those shocks were less than 5 months in duration, each of them. And each of them completely transformed the way the world thinks about energy and energy security. The creation of the International Energy Agency, the creation of the Combatant Command devoted to the Persian Gulf, the creation of a set of very complex taxes in Europe, All these ways of trying to shift preference and risk in energy came out of those crises. Now think about the crisis that Europe endured last year. It was the longest energy crisis in modern history. And there were periods where the price of electricity in some European countries went up 700%. Historically, the United States has argued that Europe was persistently weak on the energy security component. We witnessed an extraordinary transformation in a year and a half because of those external shocks, but it's come at a very high cost to the European people, as well as more obviously to the Ukrainian people. If there were to be a nuclear accident or incident on European soil associated with Zaporizhia, that could not only force Rosatom out of the world market, it could force nuclear energy out of the portfolio of energy sources that the Western developed world is willing to accept and consider. And that's particularly concerning because if we look at the present day, 50% of the zero greenhouse gas energy that Europe generates and consumes is nuclear power. Ukraine is actually leading the world in moving its telecom system into a resilient off-grid or grid resilient format. And I think we are going to see that model expand. I think we are going to see more countries recognize the advantage of making telecommunications separate, not completely separate from the grid, but given an added layer of resilience so that the grid does not become an even more attractive target.